Our first reading this morning is from Proverbs chapter 13. This is verse 12. Hope deferred makes the heart sick, but a desire fulfilled is a tree of life. May God add blessing to the reading and the understanding of these words. You're invited to stand as you're able for the gospel reading. This morning, the gospel reading is from Luke, the 24th chapter. This is the walk to Emmaus. This occurred on the same day as the resurrection of Jesus, beginning at verse 13. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed, and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. You may be seated.
One of the things that I love about this story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus is that there is a message, there is a word for each one of us in it, if we can find it and if we can hear it. That somehow in this relatively short story, there's a place for every journey of life, as Cleo, you don't mind if I call him Cleo, do you? As Cleo and his disciple friend make their way on the road, I think there's something for each one of us to hear in any journey we find ourselves in. And so as we begin, I want you to think for just a moment about what journey you find yourself on in life right now. Towards what are you heading? What are you working for? Where are you going? If you could define a journey right now. My wife and I are expecting our first child, a little girl, this summer, and that's been quite a journey for us as we move closer to that. And yet, I'm struck by some good friends of ours who are in the fertility struggle and how they're on that journey. And for them, our place feels pretty close to an end, or at least a big way station on the way. And for us, it feels like we're right in the middle of a journey. What journey are you on? Maybe it's a journey to find some sort of significance or meaning. Maybe you want to do work that makes a difference in the world. Maybe you want to find some sort of satisfaction and you want to produce something that makes a difference for other people. Or maybe it's not about that kind of fulfillment. Maybe it's just about a new normal. Maybe you're emerging from a season of grief or loss. You've lost a loved one or things have changed and all you want is peace. It doesn't need to be deeply satisfying, just a little bit of calm. What journey do you find yourself on? Is it a professional journey? Is it waiting for some new milestone in life, waiting for some project to be done, working hard towards that? Is it something in your family life, a child or yourself, some next milestone for them? Are you on a medical journey, waiting for answers, hoping to find some healing or some direction about how to move forward? Or maybe you're journeying with a loved one for whom there will be no answers. As they come near the end of their life or the end of their faculties, you know that this journey is just going to be a long one that goes in a very particular direction. What journey do you find yourself on this morning? For each one of us, wherever we are, there is a message for us in this story. And it's interesting to me because the idea of journey is very interesting, is very important for the writer of Luke and Acts. Remember, Luke and Acts are two volumes of the same story. They're written by the same author. And so he's telling this story of this good news of what God has done through Jesus Christ and through the early church. And the idea of a journey is incredibly important for him. It probably becomes clear as early as Luke 9:51, in which the writer tells us that Jesus sets his face towards Jerusalem, that he begins on this journey from Galilee to Jerusalem that will take him from familiar, welcome spaces into a hostile city, onto a cross, through an empty grave, and then eventually he will ascend to the Father. It is this journey that the whole of Luke's gospel almost is about, this journey that Jesus takes. And then in Acts, Luke will call the people who follow Jesus followers of the way or the journey. They're the people of the journey. Over and over again, he refers to them in that way. And so this concept is really important to Luke as a writer. And so then it strikes me when we come to this story today, this most familiar story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus, that they have turned their backs on Jerusalem. Presumably they had traveled with Jesus to Jerusalem, and now on the third day after he has been killed, they have turned their backs to go backwards. Their journey is one that is back, it is not forward. They're walking away from Jerusalem. Jesus set his face towards Jerusalem. They're on a journey in the wrong direction. And perhaps there are some of us this morning that just need to hear that reminder that sometimes we're on a journey in the wrong direction. We're on the wrong journey. There are times in life where if we were honest with ourselves, or if we talked to a mentor or a guide, we could realize pretty clearly that we're on the wrong journey, and yet we continue in that way anyway. Cleopas and his friend, they're on the wrong journey. Sometimes we need to be reminded of that we have a different journey to be on. They're going in the wrong direction. They're going away from what they said they had hoped. So one time they had hope, and now they say, we don't have hope. We had hoped that this and that would happen, that Jesus would redeem us, that things would be different, that this one would be a change. But now they're on the sad, slow, rather distraught journey back to normal, back to the way things were, back in the other direction, back to something familiar. Things on this journey didn't go the way they wanted, so they switched it for another journey. Their hopes had been dashed. In fact, their hopes had been crucified. And so they trade in that journey for something a little more familiar. That can happen to us as well, friends. Sometimes when life disappoints us one too many times, when we have the audacity to hope for something and then we get let down, when we're silly enough to believe that things will change and then they're still the same, when we do that one too many times, we just start to manage our hopes. And by that I mean we stop having them. We stop allowing ourselves to hope that things will get better or different, that people will change, that fulfillment will come. I remember several years ago, I got an email from Frontier Airlines, and it was a message from the CEO. I'm not sure how I got on their mailing list, but the message was about their move from being a discount airline to whatever they are now, deep discount, pedal, whatever the case is. And he said in the message all of these changes that they were making, and he said that the purpose of the email was to manage expectations. I like that phrase a lot. Oftentimes when people say, it's so nice to meet you, I say, please manage your expectations. Or maybe you've done this when a friend goes to see a movie that has a lot of hype or goes to a place that everybody talks about, and you tell them, just don't get too excited about it, okay? I wouldn't want you to be disappointed. T.S. Eliot calls the human condition the avoidance of excessive expectations. These disciples, they had excessive expectations, they had hoped, and now they don't. Now they're going back. Now they're walking away. Sometimes we get let down. Sometimes we get hurt. Sometimes things don't go the way we want and we turn the other way. We begin to manage our expectations. We begin to work more actively to avoid excessive expectation. And so our friends are on this long, sad, slow journey back. And right there in the midst of that place, right there on that road, Jesus comes to find them, which is a pretty important part of this story. Because I think a part of the message of today is the reminder that Jesus comes to find us, even when it feels like all of our hopes have been broken. Sarah Bessey talks about the disposition of these two travelers on the road as the epitome or the illustration of what Proverbs 13 talks about. If you remember those words that we read earlier, a hope deferred makes the heart sick. Hope's dashed. Jesus was dead. They're in that heart-sick place. And so they begin to start a different journey. Here, I think we see something that's important, that may be a message for somebody else this morning in the story. There are times in life where we need to simply sit and wait. Where it feels like things have unraveled, where it feels like the journey that we've been called on or that we felt like we were going to, it feels like it's all sort of fallen apart and we need to sit and wait. Cleopas and his friend, they almost miss it because they don't sit and wait, because they walk away from Jerusalem. Had Jesus not come and tracked them down, they would have missed it. But sometimes when our hope is worn thin and our rope is wearing out, sometimes we need to be reminded to sit in that moment, to sit in that discomfort. We need to be reminded that God is with us there in the midst of that as well, and we just need to sit and wait. They almost miss it because they don't sit and wait. They travel away from their community, away from what they had called, away from the journey that Jesus had been making to Jerusalem to go somewhere else, and they almost miss it. Sometimes, friends, even when life feels so disappointing and difficult, and even when this is not where we thought the road was going to go and where it was going to end, we need to sit in that moment and wait for a little bit longer, because God may show up in some way that we can't ask for or imagine. Jesus might walk through the locked door and say, guess what? I'm back. Here I am. Things can happen in ways that we can't imagine. And sometimes we just have to sit and pause and wait and pray and hope and have a community surround us to sit in the midst of that, because that's the way that God is calling us in this moment. That may be the word for you in this story this day. They almost miss it, but Jesus comes and chases them down. That's incredibly good news. They almost miss it, but God finds them on the road. And maybe that's eternally the good news of the scriptures. We almost miss it. We do things wrong. We break things, but God puts back together. But God comes and finds us. But God chases us down. Jesus meets them on the road, and they didn't recognize him. They didn't understand what he was saying at first. They didn't know what to expect in this conversation. The scripture says they look sad when Jesus asks what's going on. They look sad. And so they journey, and apparently something awakens within them. Something comes alive, because the scriptures say that they strongly urge, that they compel Jesus to stay with him. They don't invite him. They don't ask him. They don't say, would you like to have dinner with us? They urge him to stay. And he does. And then somehow in the breaking of the bread and in the prayer and in the gathering at the table, something becomes clear to them. And friends, it's the same thing that happens every time we gather at this table to partake in the bread and juice. Somehow Jesus shows up in that. We call it an eternal mystery, a holy mystery, that God shows up reliably over and over in this meal, that God meets us where we are somehow in the midst of that. It can't be explained. They can't define it, but something becomes clear to them. And all of a sudden, they have this realization, not only that God has been around them and working and ahead of them and working, but that God has been working inside of them. And it all becomes clear, and they look back on the road that they've been on and they say, were not our hearts burning within us? The journey that Jesus goes on with them is not only one from Jerusalem to Emmaus, it's also an educational journey. I think that's an important thing for us to know. Jesus doesn't just come find us and track us down on the road, not only just to be there and sit with us. I think that's a part of it. But Jesus also does it in order to bring new clarity and new direction. Somehow in what Jesus was saying, they heard something they hadn't heard before. I don't think that means that Jesus told them something that he hadn't told them before, but they heard something they hadn't heard before. You see what I'm saying? Sometimes we have to hear things over and over, but then on the right road, in the right season of life, it clicks and it makes sense. Jesus says something, and Jesus will do that when we get met on the journey of life. Something that doesn't seem clear, something will come together, and it won't come all at once, but Jesus does this because they've got big plans, big things to do. They didn't realize it. They thought they had traded in all of their hopes, but Jesus says, I've still got a plan for you. And so, friends, I think a part of this story for each one of us is that Jesus in his presence and Jesus in his education and Jesus in his revelation declares to those disciples and to us that it's okay to hope again, that it's okay to trust again, that it's okay to live again and to love again. Because God isn't done with our story and with our journey yet. Jesus says to them that basically you can't out-hope God. You can't out-dream God. You can't out-imagine what God has for your future or for the world. You can't get ahead of it. There's no dream too big or too lofty or too simple or too small or too wonderful or too amazing, because God has bigger and better things in mind. You can't out-dream God. You can't get ahead. You can't hold on to those dreams too long, because God is continuing to work, not just to resuscitate, to bring back to life places that were broken, but to resurrect, to move them forward, not to bounce back, but to bounce forward. Jesus says, hey, we've still got work to do. There's still a purpose for you. And that's an important message for us to remember. We can't out-hope Jesus. We can't out-dream God. So the disciples, they're at the table, they're living the other half of the proverb. After Jesus breaks the bread and disappears from their presence, do you remember what the second half of it is? A hope fulfilled is a tree of life. A longing fulfilled is a tree of life. What's that mean? It's a stronghold in the storm. It's a place of respite. It's a blessing for those who are near it. They knew what it was to have a sick heart, and now they know what it is to live under that tree of hope. So when this happens, when they suddenly have this revelation, what is the first thing they do? They turn around and they make their way back to Jerusalem. What's another 7 miles anyway? They turn around right there at dinner time into the night, and they run back, because a part of what this story will remind us is that for all of us and all of our journeys of life as a people of faith, God is going to continue to call us from isolation into community. And sometimes that's going to be messy, and sometimes that's going to be uncomfortable. But their dashed hopes and their grief and their loss had driven them from community into isolation, away from the other disciples, away from the place that they had been called, away from the journey that they had been a part of. And all of a sudden, when things click, when things make sense, when Jesus instructs them and meets them and moves them forward, they realize we need to reconnect with our community and with our people. We need to go back to the journey that we were on and get back on track and get things back together. They realize this all of a sudden because of the gift of Jesus, that they're called, as we're called, each one of us, from isolation into community. That will always be a part of the call of the people of faith, from individuals to community, from alone to collective and together. That will always be a part of what we're intended to know. And sometimes we lose trust. We lose hope. We lose expectation with other people. We begin to think that we can't be in relationship, or we vilify whole sects or groups or communities or political parties, other people who think and look and act and believe differently than we do, and we separate ourselves from them, and we aren't sure that we can be in relationship with them. Or sometimes we just get so caught up in our own grief, we have so many scars on our own souls that it feels dangerous to risk relationship again. Sometimes we just get comfortable in our relative isolation. And a part of this story is the reminder that God always calls us back to community over and over and over again. I think that's an important message for we who have been separated and divided and broken apart and in different places for so long. God continues to call us back to community. And maybe in this post-COVID world, it feels awkward trying to remember how all of this works, how we make small talk. I know you hate it. I love it. How we do all of those things. But I think God is calling us back to community over and over and over again. They go back to where the rest of their people are. And they declare that indeed Jesus has risen. They find out that Jesus had also showed up to them that remained. And in the midst of that, there is this promise that they still have much to do, that they have much work. That tree of life wasn't just for them, that hope fulfilled wasn't just for them, that work of resurrection wasn't just about them. This is the last thing that I want to say. I want to borrow from my friend Sarah Bessie again. She asks, when she talks about that proverb, she's sort of the one who connected this for me. She says, what is the tree of life? This is a theme that we see running throughout the scriptures. But she invites us to look to the very end of the scriptures, to the very last chapter, Revelation 22, where it describes a tree of life, and it says, there is a river of the water of life, bright as crystal, that flows from the throne of God. And on either side, on the banks of that river, there is the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit, and its leaves are for the healing of the nations. You see, the disciples probably thought at first that the hope being resurrected, the longing fulfilled, was about them, but it was so much more. And sometimes we think that our hopes being fulfilled, our journeys being redirected, all of the resurrection work that Jesus does in our own lives is just about us. But it's about so much more. For those disciples in that time, that tree of life becomes something that blesses generation after generation after generation through the world and continues to bless people as folks gather under the banner of Jesus. The church has not been perfect. It has not always embodied that without flaw. It has hurt people and it has misstepped. But over and over again, you have been blessed and I have been blessed by this community. We're a part of that family tree, that tree of life that arose out of their hopes fulfilled. But the story wasn't just about them, and it's not just about us, and it's not just about the call to community, and it's not just about our connecting with one another. It's about the very healing of the nations. Jesus looks at us and the journeys that we find ourselves on and says the hope, the plan, the idea is so much bigger than you could have asked for or imagined. So friends, on this day, may we find Jesus in all of our journeys of life. May we rejoice in the fact that God is with us. May we learn that once again, it is okay to hope and rediscover those excessive expectations. And may we find that in every journey of life and every hope fulfilled, Our story was a story meant to bless the nations. We have so much work to do as a community. The good news is that God goes with us. Amen.